Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the Talk of the Mac community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. We're in San Francisco at WWDC, talking to some of the developers and the folks that are here to learn more and whose products you'll be seeing. This time, we're talking to Justin Miller of Development Seed about MapBox. Justin, it's great to have you on Mac Voices. Thanks.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So tell me about MapBox.
So what we do is we have kind of a variety of services. Excuse me. We provide cloud hosting of map tiles, custom map tiles, and then I work on developer tools for integrating those into iOS applications for iPhone and the iPad. And we also make a Mac application and also works on Linux and Windows for designing custom maps to either put into our hosting or to put directly into apps.
Okay.
I was going to say all of it is open source and free, and we actually charge for the hosting part of it, and then the code and all that we work on is done out in the open and open source.
So why would I want to create a custom map? What kind of applications does this lend itself toward?
So there are a couple different reasons. One, you might have a certain aesthetic in the application, and you want really custom-looking colors or styles, or you want to do an application that features maps in a way where you don't want streets to be on the map, or you don't want green spaces or buildings or things like that, or you want custom colors. And another big reason is on iOS, you can use the maps offline. You don't have to have an internet connection. You can either preload the map onto the application, or you can download and then use it completely offline or unreliable internet, that sort of thing.
Okay, so help me out here. Now, we're not just talking about the creation of a pretty map of the state of California. Right. We're talking about it integrated with useful data that then can be accessed by an application or by the user.
Exactly, yeah. So we put out a worldwide base layer similar to something like Google Maps that you'd be familiar with, and we base that off of something called OpenStreetMap, which is kind of similar to Wikipedia for maps. It's publicly edited, and the data is available out there. And we use their data to make the features like green spaces, streets, direction of roads, all that kind of information, borders, administrative borders. And then you can put any kind of useful information on top of that, either right down in the map tiles that come down into your app, or points and polygons and things like that on top of the map, so that so you can dynamically do that, say, in an application.
What kind of pricing are we talking about? Is this a hundreds of dollars product? Is this a thousands of dollars product?
So for the hosting side of things, we start at the free end, and we can go on up to enterprise level accounts. So on the order of $5, $15, $50, that area, all the way up to we have a lot of news agencies who will use our stuff for hosting. It's high availability cloud hosting, so it can handle a ton of traffic. And so they'll embed it, say, in news stories on their webpage, front page feature stories, things like that. Or if you get somebody who's embedding it in a web page that gets a lot of really fast traffic, it's just we specialize in kind of being able to quickly use an embed code to stick the map right in the midst of your article. And something we really want to focus on is keeping it interactive in the midst of, and not just an image in the middle. Right. So that's basically our revenue model, and on everything else, like I was mentioning, it's open source and free. So if you just want to use the offline stuff, or you just want to hack on the tools, or you can bring your own maps into it, being open source, you're pretty much unrestricted in what you want to do.
It's interesting. So it's a product that has a specific niche, but if you have that niche, this is exactly where you would want to go.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of put it in perspective with Apple stuff. Apple, I think, is very good at coming up with an 80% solution. Like, it works perfectly well for the large majority of folks out there. But once you're outside of the limits, like you need offline use, or you want to use different data, sourcing different data, or different aesthetic colors and things like that, you're really kind of at a loss, and that's where we try to step up.
Okay, so you opened the door. One of the big announcements or things that we saw at the WWDC keynote regarded mapping and some of what Apple's doing, and a lot of interpretation by a lot of people that this is a big kiss-off to Google.
Sure.
How does this impact you, and first, and second, what is your impression of what Apple's doing and how they're trying to go about it?
So we were really excited coming into the conference because we're pretty sure something was going to happen with maps. And as it turns out, that's what they left for last in talking about iOS. And that's the top of the page on the iOS 6 preview. And so in that regard, I think it affects us pretty positively because it gets everybody talking about maps. It kind of it highlights that, Google's not the only player in the space. A lot of people in the last 5 years have thought, maps, Google and Maps, and that's pretty much it for modern, responsive type of maps. And so it kind of opens it up and says, well, there's a lot of diversity in this space and a lot of different takes on how you can do maps and the accuracy and the source data and stuff like that. And so people are talking about it, and I think it's going to be good for us in that regard. In terms of what Apple's got, I think they've got room to grow. I think there's some data issues. I put it that way. Like I think particularly outside the U.S., I think they've got to I'm not really sure yet where they're sourcing all their data from, but I think they've got to make some improvements there. And performance. So, I mean, the big change that they did in the maps, aside from, like you said, the kiss off to Google, is they've changed under the hood how it all works. It's vectors now, which means it pulls down all this data to the applications and then draws it on the actual device. And so you can do a lot of things with that, as opposed to images coming down that you just stitch together into a grid. And so that takes a lot more out of the CPU, and I would assume the battery, to do that kind of thing. So I think there's going to be room for improvement there for them to make that perform better and be more fluid and smooth and kind of what you'd expect from Apple. So.
Yeah, this is not my area, but when I heard the vector, I immediately understood just what you said. That,
right.
Okay, this is going to be creating things on the fly. On the other hand, doesn't it mean that you're not going to have as much data to pull down, since you're not pulling down images or any of that, and you're not going to have to store that much on the phone?
In general, the data that comes down is actually more bandwidth than the images.
Okay.
Yeah, because images it's similar to how it works on the web. They're designed to be compressed, and they've got these kind of lightweight formats. And the data is a ton of stuff. It's got all the information about the roads and the spaces and all their very intricate polygons, and then how they overlap each other and the styling of them. And I mean, there's so much to. I really admire cartographers, and there's so much art to the way things indicate that it's becoming a ramp and going up a little bit, how you do that, and at least in the 2D sense. I mean, 3D and what Apple's shown with that, it makes it a lot easier to visualize what's going on, especially if there's a plane or something flying over to basically take a snapshot of it. But when you want to represent that in 2D, it becomes really subtle.
Which brings up the flyover view. Is this just eye candy? I mean, because you're a hardcore map guy, obviously. So is this just eye candy for the rest of us, or is this something you think can be very useful?
I think it can be useful. It's pretty cool because you could be in a street level and you can kind of tilt the street however you'd like to see it and get an idea of how the building's laid out and scope out a block in another country before you even go there. And it's kind of I think it's more powerful than what you saw with Google Street View. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting. And at this point, it's really only the big boys who can do that kind of stuff because they've got airplanes flying overhead and all this kind of stuff. It gets expensive very quickly.
Fleet of drones right now overhead.
Yeah, exactly.
Taking our pictures.
Yeah.
Street View, take nothing away from Google, and I'm not saying it just because it's Apple. It's always been very cool. It's been exciting. But it also is static. And we've all gone someplace on Google Maps and looked, and a house is not there, a building is not there,
right.
Or an old building was there or something. And so it becomes dated, and trying to keep that up in real time is a challenge. And my impression is that by doing this, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's the same data and it's just got to be updated, but it feels like it maybe should be able to stay a little more current.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if they're getting these systems in place, that's probably one of the, aside from like the subtlety of cartography that I mentioned, probably the biggest issue that comes with maps is sourcing your data and where the data comes from and how accurate it is and how fast it's changing and then how fast you can bring that into your actual maps. And I think that's going to be probably the most difficult thing for Apple to tackle because it's just, you can partner with different people, but there's a lot of people operating in that space and you've got to have something that makes it stand out and that makes it, really responsive to changes on the ground. And so it remains to be seen, but hopefully they've got good data sources. So.
There was a time outside of maybe standalone GPSs, which are now all but obsolete, that maps were just kind of maps, at least I think for a lot of people. And all of a sudden now, maps have become cool, cartography has become cool, the whole geolocation and what that can do for you. A lot of us, I think, are still trying to appreciate that. And then when you see it implemented, I mean, Foursquare, Gowalla, those things, the check-in, they sort of pioneered it, but now we're seeing Apple and some others try to take it to another level.
Yeah.
What's that do for you all? Does it just open opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it's becoming more and more common because you've got these pocket supercomputers that know your personal location. They can make context very relevant. And I think it's great to see people operating in the space and like with the SDK that I work on, I basically write code for developers to put that into their apps, which is something I really like doing. And yeah, I think the opportunities are good. I mean, you mentioned Foursquare. They actually switched from Google Maps to our Maps back in March.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was a really big boon because we're kind of a small company, and
Yeah.
that was awesome. And they basically kind of put their stamp of approval on the idea that we're sourcing data from OpenStreetMap, and that's they're kind of investing in that commons and keeping that data out there. And I mean, data, map data kind of, it belongs to everybody. It represents our world and the place around us, and there's different skills you can apply to it to differentiate. But OpenStreetMap is kind of based on this idea that there should be like a base level, map data out there for everybody. It should be really responsive to changes and able to be leveraged for all kinds of useful purposes. So, yeah.
It's out there happening, and it's coming to our phone. It's already been there. And
Yeah.
I mean, plenty of times just this week we've used the existing maps on the iPhone to navigate around and find somewhere.
Right.
And now that's just going to get easier, more intense, and more useful.
Yeah. One interesting development. I gotta think carefully here because a lot of the stuff this week's under NDA.
Yeah, I don't want to do any editing. So don't say
Right.
anything.
Sure. So one thing they announced in the keynote is this change in the way transit and routing apps will work. And they mentioned that they're going to be pushing this to third parties. So that's kind of an interesting take and a differentiator from where they're doing it with Google, because Google was very much about centralizing. I mean, they came out with a format. I forget what's called off the top of my head. I think it's like GTFS or something like that. And a lot of municipalities adopted that as the way that they would publish their transit info, and that's how you make transit apps. Mm-hmm. And so now Apple's kind of switched away from Google, and they're working on, they've got their own maps and everything. And so with this routing stuff, it looks like they're going to push that out to third-party developers in geographically relevant areas and make that available right from the Maps app. So that's kind of an interesting take in how they're doing that. It's a bit different than they've operated before, keeping it all within that application. So I think it's a kind of two reasons they're doing that. One, I mean, they don't have data the same way, the same as when they had their partnership with Google. Mm-hmm. But secondly, I mean, they always like to highlight third-party developers, and so it's just interesting to see them do that in this way. So,
there's a darker side to this potentially, at least the privacy people say, the ability to track you and all the implications of that, the positives and the negatives.
Yeah.
Do you have any strong feelings? I mean, because again, you come from a different perspective than most of us.
I mean, it's like and it's not like a lot of the other data we have. Email on big company servers and all kinds of information. We're putting increasingly more of it. I mean, iCloud's a great example. It's just a ton of data, all your contacts, all your appointments, all that kind of thing. And location is similar, but it's also very different because it's highly personal and it changes rapidly, and a lot can be learned by studying location. And so I don't have any super strong feelings on it, other than the need for transparency by companies. I think Apple's doing a pretty good job. I mean, they had a flap in the past year around. It was revealed that they were storing information about cell towers that you were near in the phone, and it turns out that and they mentioned this in a press release, and they kind of highlighted more this week actually in the keynote. But they were crowdsourcing anonymously this data to help make their traffic data better. And so that's kind of an interesting leverage point they have, because they Tim Cook mentioned they have over 300 million iOS devices sold. And so you've got a third of a billion devices out there that are roaming around, and they've got a lot of crowdsourcing potential to leverage. Whether it's, I wondered if they might do something like, the majority of those devices have cameras. I wondered if they might help make their 3D information better via crowdsourcing. Just snap a picture of the block, and then they can stitch all these things together. So, but back to the privacy thing. I think they've done a good job with, you can turn location services on and off. And when you deploy this in the enterprise, you can disable that. So things like the Pentagon or whatever can have these devices and not worry about, all this kind of stuff. And they're trying to be upfront. I mean, people thought they had something on them with this crowd sourcing traffic data, but they were pretty upfront about it. And I think it's just important that they have these policies up there and are held accountable when things go awry. As they sometimes do in big, large organizations. But
what makes me crazy, I think there is a level of paranoia. Some of it's justifiable. But at some point, these are the kind of things that, I don't care if it's Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, whoever, they're going to have to crowdsource some of this information. It's just data to figure out where they need to deploy what,
Right.
and where they need the assets and the resources.
Right.
So it just never has bothered me that much, especially given the fact that I don't do anything that anybody's going to be that interested in.
Right.
So, maybe maybe if I were a subversive of some kind, it would be an issue.
Right. Well, I mean, that can be an issue. Places in the developing world and things like that, location and, repressive governments and things like that. So it's just important that companies are clear about what they're doing with it and how to enable and disable it, and that sort of thing. So
and just like all social media, if you're doing something you don't want known, don't put it on your Facebook or Twitter account. If you're going somewhere you don't want anybody to know you're going, don't take your phone. And I don't mean be paranoid. Don't turn it off. Leave it somewhere. It's easy to my way of thinking, but I'm simple. Where do folks go to if they want to engage your services or just learn more about you?
Just MapBox.com. We have a pretty filled out website. We have a lot of documentation. Like I said, a lot of our stuff's oriented for developers. So we have a lot of documentation and code examples. And so I aside from the SDK that I work on a lot of sample apps that show off these different things that kind of pull little pieces off and bundle it in a very small app so you can understand concepts. And so I put a lot of that stuff on, or basically all of that stuff on GitHub. That's where we have all our source code. So you can also see github.com/MapBox.
Great.
But MapBox.com is a great starting point. We have a tour, videos, and all kinds of stuff.
Thanks so much for the time. Justin has been enlightening.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Folks, this is Mac Voices. We are at Worldwide Developers Conference in San Francisco, and we'll be back with more soon. I'm Chuck Joyner. Thanks for listening. MacVoicesTV is part of the MacVoices Group and a member of Mac Level 10.